Welcome to the Decolonising Education YouTube channel. Today we're talking about decolonising research and how to navigate the research process. Today we're talking with Andrea, Ian and Carolina. I'm just going to ask them to quickly introduce themselves and then we will have our conversation. Andrea, do you want to start?
Yes, thanks Muna for inviting me. So my name is Andrea Jimenez and I'm originally from Peru. I'm currently a lecturer at the Information School at the University of Sheffield. So the Information School is a department that where we research all aspects around technology and the impact of technology in society. And so my research centers around the role of innovation and technology in socioeconomic development, and more specifically in how the concept of innovation has entered the international development sector. And what I explore is the kind of underlying assumptions and the kind of political implications around innovation, and critique it from a perspective of how it promotes a kind of Eurocentric Western epistemological and ontological stance. And so adopting a decolonial lens, what I want to explore is how can we reimagine innovation so that it can acknowledge other forms of being and thinking. So I specifically work around the concept of buen vivir or summa causa, which is sort of informed by the indigenous epistemologies and knowledges in different parts of Latin America, and working with a indigenous-led initiative called the Potato Park in Peru, where it's like a community-led organization where 6 different indigenous communities have gathered to under the cosmovision of summa causa, to live and to work and to govern the space. So we've been working with them to try to find how they work, how they interact within each other, and through those processes how innovations are coming about. And that's sort of what my research is about. Then more specifically in the Information School, besides my role as a lecturer, I've also been given the task of decolonizing the curriculum of the Information School, which is quite, decolonizing curriculums is quite trendy right now in UK universities. And so I've been given that role, which brings all sorts of, I guess, challenges, because there's obviously all sorts of issues with this idea of decolonizing the curriculum. What does that actually mean? And what do you not decolonize? You know, like if you only focus on the curriculum, is what else is sort of missing? So that's just a little bit of what I'm been doing here.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Carolina?
Hey, nice meeting you. Thank you, Dr. Muna, Andrea and Ian. Nice meeting you. I'm here in Boston. I was born in Spain, in Madrid. In Salamanca. My family home is located in Madrid. But I've been living many years outside my home. Many years. I studied in London as well. And I came into the United States. I study here. And now I'm a medical anthropologist working for Harvard Medical School, Massachusetts General Hospital, with different programs, community health programs, right? And right now we're focusing on immigration, because in recent years, the immigration community has suffered for a variety of reasons, especially from our government policies. So we are supporting our communities and especially focusing on expression, on formations and identity, and also thinking about how we can develop ourselves as people, as persons in new territories, no, as immigrants. So that's what we're doing right now, no, these type of programs that are community support. But now I'm also very interested in looking back home. You know, I have my eyes back into Spain, and also looking at where my family originates, you know, my Black side. So I'm looking also at Equatorial Guinea. I don't know if you have heard about this country. Yeah. Equatorial Guinea is a very tiny country in West Africa, Central West Africa. So I have decided to dedicate my PhD to the country, using my skills, all my knowledge that I have acquired as a Black woman in the diaspora, no? And my perspective, my position right now is a Black woman in the diaspora. right? I'm a traveler. I am a nomad. So I found challenging myself to actually settle and particularly establish my situation and my position in the education system and at universities and at the schools. So that's why that's why I found it very interesting, the part of decolonizing education, because I come in with a new narrative. I come in with a new perspective that is basically a little bit invisible, especially in Spain and in Equatorial Guinea. No, Black women who are immigrants, Black women who are travelers, Black women who we have studied at different universities, Black women who are global. We have a lot to say, especially now in Spain. We have a lot of problems with integration. We have a lot of problems with invisibility. Black communities are marginalized. There is a lot of racism. Okay, I am being very clear. So I think this is where I come in. I have a lot of challenges deciding, well, probably we can talk a little bit more about that, but I have, as a woman, as a Black woman in the diaspora, I found it very challenging to find where to do my PhD. How? Where? Because I am from here, but I'm not from here. You know, this is very futuristic, right? This is where we're moving on. The world is getting smaller for some of us, I believe. So I'm thinking, which department? So I will say in Boston, we have a lot of great schools, but I couldn't find support. You know, there is very limited knowledge about Equatorial Guinea, especially an African country where the Spanish is the official language, right? So I also wanted to go to Equatorial Guinea, but I couldn't find a job. How am I going to support myself there? Okay, so then I found a school in Madrid where there is a department called Afro-Hispanics department, which, by the way, is closing down. Why? There is no support in Spain of African studies. There is no Afrocentric education, right? There is the literature, and looking at it, there are no Black writers, Spanish Black writers, Spanish Black educators. So I find myself in a very interesting position. I find that an opportunity for me to find a place and to see where I can get in so that I can support the communities there as well, right? So this is where I am right now in this situation as well. So this is my story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Ian?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I had to switch from, so I'm Ian Calliou. I'm, I guess you'd call ethnically Métis, although I don't really consider myself to be ethnically Métis. I consider myself to be an Indigenous Canadian from Canada, from the Michel First Nation on my father's side. And I'm living in the UK. I'm just finished my PhD at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations at Coventry University. Prior to that, I did my LLM in Human Rights Law from University of York's Center for Applied Human Rights. And I mean, I've sort of, I don't want to say like I've successfully negotiated it, but I've sort of negotiated this sort of Western academy in order to articulate, I guess, Indigenous knowledge in my own PhD. My own PhD and my own research interest is about what you call an Indigenous research paradigm. And that's basically ways to use Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing to answer any science problem, but generally social science questions. And it was something that I found quite tricky. You know, a lot of people asked why I came to the UK to do my PhD. And I think I sort of like what Carolina was touching on, which is that, well, where do you do this research? Part of why I came here was I wanted to get that distance between the discourse that's very much colonially embedded in Canada. Traditionally, Indigenous peoples have been marginalized to what we call like a Native Studies department, which tend to be quite, they were multidisciplinary before multidisciplinary was a thing, just because they needed a place to put all these indigenous peoples that were finishing their PhDs, and they say stuck them in the Native Studies department, and they became this sort of hodgepodge. And now that multidisciplinary is sort of the order of the day, now all of a sudden they've sort of had a step up in one sense, but at the same time, you know, a lot of them have been sort of, I don't say isolated there, but they've been sort of put there in these, you know, departments. And so I wanted to escape that sort of discussion, and that's why I came to the UK. But in doing so, I stepped into this sort of positivist, Western dominated practice that on the one hand is very interested in the idea of decolonization, but on the other hand is actually quite resistant to the idea that they might be part of the problem. I've just been recently, and I'm sure you guys have been read before, but Quijano's Coloniality of Power, and that's something that sort of quite recently informed a lot of my work. I mean, you as somebody who, like Andrea, is like negotiating both worlds, you want to feel like people can be allies, but at the same time, when you start to peel back the layers, you find out that people who you thought were allies are no worse. In fact, in many ways, much worse than the people who are actually overtly colonial or racist or, you know, anti-indigenous in many ways, you know, because the cautioned, oh, we can be objective on this, tends to actually be more harmful because it causes you to question, or in many cases causes you to have to justify indigenous methods in a Western academic practice, which is even more troubling because then you get into this game of that exactly based on Quijano's coloniality, where you're trying to justify a hierarchy or try to justify a system of knowledge, and actually reinforcing that cultural system that they talk about as the reinforcing factor for the other things. So, you know, that's one thing that I sort of have negotiated, and I think it sounds like everybody else has had that same sort of challenge, and that's sort of more recently where I've approached it. But I'm just very interested in how indigenous peoples talk about knowledge, and how their knowledge is not seen as this sort of anti-science, but rather a form of science, a form of inclusive science that is millennia old and tested and just as scientific as everything else.
Brilliant. Thank you guys so much for just powerful introductions. There's so many things that we could delve into right now, but I just want to start off with the research process. So we've all done research in contexts that may seem as colonial spaces. How have you found designing research, having in mind that you would need to negotiate the ethical processes that are set by these structures, but at the same time having in your mind the people that you would be doing this research with, and having to engage with a different set of ethics and knowledge systems for that piece of work? How did you negotiate doing the two simultaneously, or did you know that you would need to do the two when you embarked on research to begin with?
Mm-hmm. Would you like me to?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, so I think this is a really interesting question. I think in my case, so I would say I consider myself as a researcher from the global south that is in a global north, research in the global south, right? So my discipline is development studies. And there's all sorts of contradictions within that framing in itself. And there is a current funding sort of program in the UK, which is called the Global Challenges Research Fund, the GCRF, which is basically the UK government is putting a lot of money trying to support universities and fund research that focuses on the global south and doing research in the global south. And as part of that, I received a small pot of money to do the research that I was interested in doing. And that is a really, it was a really interesting aspect of thinking about the funding and the politics that bring the funding as well. And I think I definitely found myself in all sorts of complicated situations with, for instance, with what to actually do with the money and how to actually work with the communities that I have been working with, right? Because a big issue is, okay, how do you navigate this space without kind of trying to reproduce the neo-colonial experiences that already come with the funding, right?
Yeah.
This funding coming from the UK to fund research in the global south, it's in itself, it's quite colonial, you know. The one thing that was really surprising for me actually was the experience in looking at the academia in Peru, actually. So one of the things I did when I went to do my research in Peru was work with two different groups of people with the indigenous community, but also with the Peruvian academics, because I wanted to understand a little bit about the work that they've been doing. And that is where I found most of the challenges, actually.
That's really interesting. Why was that the case, do you think?
Well, I think reading some post-colonial literature, the academics I would say the academics in Peru, they're part of an elite, right? They're part of an elite that have formed their careers using the Eurocentric Western knowledge, right? That's how they form their reputation. That's how they form their experience. And so I'm a young woman with a PhD, which already in the Peruvian context, it's not normal. Normally, people that do PhDs have been working for years and years and doing research for years. So I'm coming to Peru saying, hey, why don't we, instead of looking outside and thinking, okay, let's see how things are being done somewhere else, why don't we just look inward and try to see what's being done here to try to understand more about the processes happening within our country. That was a big challenge for them, and they did not take that nicely, and that was a really interesting experience to go as well. And I think from that I got this understanding that I navigate the research process based on this sort of fluidity and in-betweenness that brings me both some aspects of feeling at disadvantage and feeling like I don't belong, but at the same time it gives me a huge I have some level of responsibility and privilege that comes with that I need to also be aware of and that I need to recognize moving forward in my research.
I mean,
go on, sorry, Ian.
Go on. So it really brings up an interesting point, and I think that's one of the things that I thought about certainly going into my viva, but in my research is like the idea of colonialism and coloniality. You're sort of left with this sort of three different options. Do you confront it? Do you challenge it? Or do you ignore it? And I'm sort of the thinking that you sort of ignore the colonial structures. Obviously, sometimes you can't. But I mean, for me, the idea is that if you confront or challenge it, then it almost gives them agency to challenge you back. And so, I don't know, that's maybe something that we could talk about later, but I think that was just something I thought about just throughout my own research and what Andrea had said.
To what extent, so this is just a question for you, Ian, to what extent can you ignore the colonial structures if it's embedded in your PhD? If it's embedded in the PhD process?
I think that going back to the question, that was the one thing. So I went into the field with a perfectly Western designed research structure. I thought that, in order for Indigenous peoples to articulate themselves within the idea of reconciliation, which I was talking about, is we needed to use the master's tools. To sort of borrow Audre Lorde, we need to tear down the master's house with the master's tools, but she says you can, and in some ways you can't. And so once I got to the field, I sort of struck by the idea of research being a ceremony. Both it is a ceremony itself, and it's also sort of as a ceremony, research as a ceremony. And so with the idea of how I sort of dealt with the coloniality is I actually tried to ignore it. And that caused me much grief through the PhD process because I was constantly confronted with this isn't good enough, you know, essentially told at one point to go home and quit. And I think one of the ways that you can effectively ignore it is when I got to my examiners, and all three of my examiners were from a colonial context doing work in decolonial research and had a sympathetic ear, even though all three of them, we had someone from Sri Lanka, a Tamil, or Sri Lankan woman, and we had someone from India, I believe Sikh, who did work, and then another woman from Latin America, and I believe from Colombia. And all three of them actually said, this works great. It's amazing. It's really relevant. And I think by having real allies, not people who purport to be allies, is the way you ignore. And I think that's sort of like what we were talking about before, about the idea of the academy asking, where are these Indigenous researchers going? Because they disappear from the universities. But they're going back to their own communities to help support Indigenous people doing research, or Indigenous peoples, because that's how you know, they talk about Fanon's the politics of recognition, and Coulthard has the same sort of, and you know, until you find a way to get recognition, sometimes recognition doesn't come through this conflict. It comes from actually just ignoring it and creating your own system that's seen as, you know, self-supporting. And I think that was one of the ways that I eventually came out the other side, was again meeting with yourself and Andrea last year in Sheffield, and just finding the courage to say, I'm just going to ignore that talk, because that talk's only going to be negative, and finding a way, just do it, and then finding good allies at the other end to support that type of research. That's yeah,
brilliant. Carolina, what about you?
I like very much what you, Andrea, and I are saying in regards to allies, you know, and partnership, and also, you know, community is a very important word that keeps coming up, especially in my research. So right now I'm in Boston. I am trying to keep connected with my Department of Anthropology in Spain. I find it very challenging for various reasons, and I'm gonna tell you why. First, I need to go back to study in Spanish. It's many years that I don't do academic studies in Spanish, to be honest with you. I also need to get familiarized with the new syllabus as well, right? Literature that is a new anthropology, okay? Because from my experience, when you are learning anthropology, you learn different perspectives in different countries. I studied anthropology first in London, in the United Kingdom. Then I moved to New Mexico, and I learned the anthropology of Native American communities, right? I learned about, I met anthropologists that are also Native, okay? Here in Boston, anthropology is very focused on application, on practice, critical. Anthropology in Spain is very different, it's very cultural. They think that we as anthropologists, we need to sit down and observe. Whereas it's not the case here. Anthropologists, we need to be involved in politics, right? This is what I've been learning here. So that this is one of the challenges, you know, me, myself adapting, but I also seen it as an opportunity for me to actually revitalize the department, right? Bring in new knowledge, my Black perspectives, okay? Because I want to cite Black women, right? There is no literature in the Department of Anthropology at the university that I'm studying now in Madrid that cites Black anthropologists, especially Black anthropologists from Spain. That's unheard of. So it's an excellent opportunity for me to keep looking into it and keep communicating and finding allies, like you saying, create community and search, because I'm new also in Spain as well, right? In terms of, I only have my family. Spain has changed throughout all these years I've been away, right? So I want to find also that black community. I want to also find those black women that are in academia. Who are they, right? Can we get together? Can we have a talk? So that's another thing that I'm looking into it. And another aspect, Equatorial Guinea, where Equatorial Guinea fits in all this. All right, you have to understand that Equatorial Guinea is a West African country. It was colonized by Spain in the late 800s. It got independence in 1968. Why I'm interested in Equatorial Guinea? Because it's part of who I am. My father was born there. My father is an immigrant. He left Equatorial Guinea to go to Spain. I'm going back to my roots, right? I mean, I've been surviving and living throughout all these years, and now I'm conscious, okay? Now I want to know more about Africa. Now I want to know more about my family there. So that's why I started traveling to Equatorial Guinea and back. And I learned that, yeah, Equatorial Guinea was independent in 1968, but there is still a lot of problems, right? Especially, we're talking in the academia, in the educational system. You have to understand that Spanish is the official language. Yes, most schools from primary, secondary, high school, university are being taught, I mean, they use the Spanish language, okay? The schools in the country are being leveled up by who is teaching, right? Most professors there are from Spain. So there is still a lot of colonial aspects in the country, a lot, I have to say. Equatorial Guinea is not free. It's not a free country in many sense. And I also have to say that there is a dictatorship there, okay? We have been under the regime of a dictatorship since independence. Okay, so what is my role there? You know, I had to be careful as well, and I had to be cautious as well, especially me coming as anthropologist, focusing on a PhD study, okay, on the topic of mental health in its relationship with the dictatorship, okay, and coming from a perspective of critical and applied anthropology. But I'm also coming from the West, okay? I'm receiving education from the United States. I'm receiving education from a school in Madrid. I have tried to be educated in Equatorial Guinea, but it hasn't been possible, okay? So there are many challenges. So what you were mentioned before, Ian, Andrea, community is very important. Find alliances is very important. Speaking up, presenting myself by who I am, right? Is also very important, being transparent, okay? Just saying what I need, what I want, and how I can collaborate. Okay, because I also find that in Equatorial Guinea, in Spain, there are a lot of Equatorial Guineans that are also sharing with me my perspectives as well. So this is very important. You see, we all come from different places. We all have different experience, but this is a very positive thing. We all can put on the table our skills, our professions, our qualities to work together towards a common benefit. So that's my goal, okay? I think this is a very important aspect for me in terms of decolonizing academia, being clear, being transparent, and also support those communities who are being oppressed by a dominant discourse and by a dominant practice. If I'm coming from a medical anthropology perspective, I'm looking at medical practices as well, where you find also politics within them, right? So I'm looking at biomedicine, how it's being managed in the country, and looking at what the community is doing to look after their own, right? So support those communities that are being oppressed by biomedicine care, because this is very obvious as well. You know, this is going to be also part of my thesis, you know, look at biomedicine and look at medical care from a political lens, and support those who are oppressed and join forces. So I see myself as a collaborator, okay? And I have a lot of things to say. I'm not gonna hide, I'm not gonna shut up, I'm just gonna share what I have, my knowledge, my worldwide knowledge. I'm just gonna present myself as a character that comes from the diaspora and has a right to be there
you know, because my father is from there, and it's a way to claim my place with respect, and also, you know, sharing my values, and that's what is important. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, brilliant. I think all three of you touched upon a really important point, and that is the idea of identity. And your research is connected to you, it's connected to who you are, it's deeply personal. And very often, especially in the West, we're told that even if research isn't objective, and you believe that research is subjective, there's a separation between you and your research, or there's a separation between you and your participants. And I really like the point that you made, Carolina, in the sense that you said it's collaboration. You're working together, you are a part of the research as well, and the research process is about building a community and sharing and exchanging and creating new knowledge. And we've all done research that is deeply personal and deeply connected to who we are as individuals. I'm based in the UK, but I made the conscious decision to do my PhD looking at the Somali community, because it's the community that I'm from. It's a diaspora community. It's a community that has been colonized by Britain, is part of the diaspora that's living in Britain at the moment, that has gone through the education system. There are indigenous methods that we use that I've tried to incorporate into my research, but you also can't ignore the fact that not all the knowledge that we have within our communities is indigenous. So a lot of it can be internalized colonial practices that we're not even aware of. And I found very much in my research, I'm not sure if you did as well, that while I was doing the research, I was falling into this term of colonial slippage, where I was doing things without realizing I was actually colonizing the process. And it was the participants themselves that were saying to me, you're taking away power from me in that moment. And that awareness that I needed to raise about what I was doing in the process. And I think Linda T.Y. Smith's work is fantastic in this, where she talks about the way in which you design the research, thinking about both lenses, where you can't assume that you're going in there to give voice. There's no such thing as giving voice. You can only provide space for people to share their voices. You can't give something to somebody that they already have. But I think the idea that research is deeply personal is something that we try and shy away from, especially in Western academia, and I'm not sure why that is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you mentioned that, so I'm currently doing this postgraduate certificate in teaching, right? And for that, I had to write my teaching philosophy. And my tutor gave me feedback, and she basically said, oh, you know, it's really interesting how deeply personal your teaching philosophy is, how you start from your own experience and your own identity to talk about how it is your experience in the world and how you look at how you see yourself positioning in the world that informs your teaching. And I thought, well, doesn't everybody do that, right? I mean, surely that is the right thing to do, but it sounds like for her it was a strange thing to do. I just wanted to say, based on what you've all said, this just reminded me, last year I went to Linda T.Y. Smith's talk in London for the Sociological Review.
Yeah.
And she started her presentation with a huge image of cracked eggshells. It was just, that's all the image was. Cracked eggshells, thousands and thousands of them. And she said something around the lines of, if you didn't remember the shape of the egg, how can you reconstruct it? Right?
That's powerful.
Yes, and she said this is exactly the kind of work that we have to do with indigenous knowledge and indigenous thinking. That a lot of the work that we actually have to do is to see how we reconstruct that egg. And this reminded me, or made me think, based on what Carolina was saying before, that to me, decoloniality is a choice. Whereas, you know, we could all exist in a post-colonial world, and post-coloniality could be a condition, it could just be a reality, but decoloniality is the choice of wanting to move forward and reimagine and reconstruct the parts of yourself that might have been broken because you live in this sort of in this kind of complexity of modernity, coloniality, capitalism, patriarchy, all of this kind of axis of oppression that could shape how we position in the world. And I just think that, to me, when I think about that, the decolonial space, it gives me hope.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you said decoloniality is about choice, and it's about hope. And I remember reflections that I had when I was doing my PhD, and I was talking to my supervisor about wanting to turn this into a decolonial project. And the first thing he asked me was, where do you see this going? And I said, for me, the optimism of decoloniality is not where it goes, but what it allows me to work against.
Yeah.
It gave me a framework of saying these structures that are set in place that I've always been told is, this is the truth, this is what knowledge you're supposed to acquire. I was finally given a framework that said to me, you don't have to, and there is another option, you can do things a different way. So it wasn't really the destination. For me, decoloniality is never about reaching indigenous, whatever this definition of indigenous knowledge is, because for my particular community, I don't know what that indigenous knowledge is, because it has been influenced by so many different things. That for me, decoloniality was just about the things that I found restrictive and sometimes suffocating, I could slowly dismantle and pull apart. So that idea of change and choice, it was really powerful for me. I like the analogy of the cracked eggs, and the idea that our experiences and our knowledges are fragmented.
Yeah, I think it's really powerful. And just in the following, the idea of the choice based on what Carolina said, you make choices, as she was saying, you make choices on who you cite, for instance. You make choices on who you research, as you said before as well. You know, you've decided to research your own community. You're constantly making choices in the research process. And if you look at it from a decolonial perspective, you actually have a choice to do that moving forward. And in everything that you do, I don't think there is a way in which you can say, actually, I'll just focus on this aspect of decoloniality, and then everything else, I'll just pretend it doesn't exist, you know?
Yeah.
There's a concept in the indigenous research that I'm embedded in, which is this idea of what's called relational accountability. And that's the idea that your research has to be accountable for the communities you're doing research in. And that's really interesting, sort of talking back to what you guys were just talking about, this sort of idea of doing research and why you do research. And it's one thing that's quite interesting is that within dominant practice, there's a lot of lip service paid to certain aspects. And one of the things, think about the criteria for a PhD, having this original contribution to knowledge. And going back to that discussion, but you talked about politics of recognition and Coulthard and Fanon, for indigenous researchers, just contributing, it's much more imperative than just the Western idea of a contribution. The original contribution to knowledge in Western practice is that the criteria, I think the definition of it is that you actually did a research project to the end. I think that's the sort of, that's an original contribution. But when you look at indigenous voices that have been disempowered, your contribution serves as an example for how indigenous people can do research. And so, and because it's racially accountable, you actually have an imperative as an indigenous researcher to have an actual real contribution to knowledge that's not just a contribution of your own, but a contribution of your community. And if you can't answer that question, one of the people that I was talking with earlier in my project was like, oh, I can't go back to my community because of this research I did. And she said that to me like it was supposed to be something profound, and that's what research is supposed to do. It's supposed to alienate you from, you know, that sort of objective frame, or as Memi calls it, this academic apartheid. But really, like I said, if I can't go back to my community, that's a tragedy. Why would I want to do research where I can't go back to the community that the community is not proud of? And sort of to go back to this idea that we talked about before, those three sort of things that you have to deal with decolonization. Do you confront it? Do you challenge it? Or do you ignore it? And that original contribution is part of that ignoring it. It's part of that adding to the discussion that legitimizes indigenous voices that are served as examples for other indigenous researchers. And I was challenged quite early on personally to do an easy PhD, to get it done and get it out of the way, and then go solve the problems of the world later. And I said no, because if there's another indigenous researcher coming up and they're looking for examples of indigenous research and they can't find it because I didn't take the hard step, they're not going to take the hard steps either. And when you go back to that sort of lip service of the original contribution, indigenous researchers, we have two people we need to satisfy. We need to satisfy the academy, but we really need, the most important thing we need to satisfy is our communities. And if we don't, original contribution doesn't satisfy that relationally accountable imperative of indigenous knowledge, it's not worth doing. Research isn't worth doing. And I think that's why you have this sort of watered down idea of original contribution to knowledge and dominant practice. And I don't want to pick on them, but the research doesn't satisfy communities. It's rather self-satisfying in a very strong way. And if it's self-satisfying, it is part of this sort of idea of colonial, not collectivization, but individuality that's embedded in capitalism, that's embedded in this sort of, all these sort of colonial structures that are entirely devoid of this indigenous, integrated, cohesive, embedded structures, you know. And I think the work that Andrea does is very relevant to that, because if she just comes in externally and sort of tries to, you know, find ways to take indigenous knowledge and sort of transport it outside of the communities, then those communities are going to be, they're going to suffer because their knowledge practices are going to be exploited, but B, at the same time, it also sort of like, I don't know, it sort of breaks down that trust that is essential in indigenous research.
Yeah, and that relational accountability is hugely important, because a lot of the times the assumption is that you can, especially with research, there's the idea that you can go in and then go out, and even ethics applications ask you to think about what you're going to do once the research is over, to leave. And if you're an indigenous researcher, or if you're a member of that community, these aren't people, or these aren't communities that you're engaging with for the first time. And once the research ends, you're not leaving that community. They're still a part of you, and that connection is still there. And even the binary of insider and outsider researcher becomes really complicated and intertwined, because you're constantly in that in-between space where you're never really going to be outside of the research, but you're always going to be seen by that community while you're working for academia or doing a piece of research as somebody who's not quite an insider. Because there are certain things that you're going to be expected to do by structures that may ethically go against what the community would expect of you, or it might undermine the trust. And I think that those are things that are often neglected when we think about research. The idea that when you're doing research, it's not about stepping in and stepping out, but it's about that relational accountability. What do you do to create relationships, and then what do you do to sustain and meaningfully sustain those relationships? Carolina, you wanted to say something?
I just want to comment, the coloniality for me is freedom, is independence. I actually want to work on creating new curriculums that are focusing on my perspective, my persona as an anthropologist, so that we are all clear, so we are understanding where I'm coming from. Curriculums that are specifically focused on diasporas, African diasporas who are doing academic work, right? It's very important to also understand those people like myself that are floating around, right? This is a new kind of knowledge that we need to keep developing as well, right? New syllables of specifically African diasporas in the academia, because we are so diverse, and we mostly we are invisible voices, mostly we are misunderstood. So it's very important also bring this new knowledge of worlds of the diaspora, African diaspora, into our own side of research, because I think we also want to find also understanding, right? In my case, in Equatorial Guinea, in Malabo, in Bata, in the main cities, they receive me, they hear me out, right? They welcome me, right? Because I have things to say, I come from new worlds, I'm a new person and a new character, and it's interesting to be also received in this way, and they accept it, and my community, my family in Equatorial Guinea, they are eager to hear more about it. And many people in that country are also eager to receive, let's say, different, right? In their schools, in their one only university, okay? So that's also very important as well. Perhaps no adaptations that are our part, but also new creation, new ways of doing research. That also is important to put it out there, because this is innovation, right? And it's important also to be here, and it's important also to bring our guidance, our experiences, because we are one of a kind, I would say, and it's important to be there as well and be understood, especially if we are not born to stay, grow up, work in one sole country for all our lives, right? We need that space as well. So that's what I have to say, and I hope to keep working on that. Okay, yeah. So that's, and I think community and alliance is going to help me to develop this kind of work as well. In my thesis, a big chunk of my thesis is going to be that reflection of positionality and reflections of new syllables of African diaspora studies, where I belong to. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think for me, there's a real emotional impact to doing this work. It feels hard and it feels exhausting, and it feels like there isn't a separation between the work that we do and the emotional responses that we have throughout every single stage. I don't know about the rest of you, but for me, doing the PhD was a very lonely experience, because you're doing something that, and trying to incorporate a decolonial process, and nobody around you understands why you're asking questions about everything, and things that seem like really small things, like why do you need to do an ethics form and then do an additional form that outlines all the things that the ethics form was missing? Why are you creating more work for yourself? Why are you spending more time with communities? And all of these questions, and it becomes hard to do the work, but then also explain to people that you want to be allies in the process, why you need to do this work. So how did you guys find navigating the research process and the emotional impact of it?
Do you want me to go ahead?
Go for it.
Just as a caveat, so most of this decolonial work I've been doing was as part of my postdoc. So it was within my PhD that I sort of started discovering all of this decolonial thinking. And then during my postdoc is when I decided to actually implement it. I think the biggest thing for me has had to be that I've had to, before I decide to decolonize anything, I've had to almost decolonize myself, unlearn a lot of the things that I've had so embedded within me. Almost, and that made me a bit angry as well. I was educated for my bachelor's in Peru, which is where Aníbal Quijano is from. I'd never heard of Aníbal Quijano until I came here. There's an element of anger that I got from actually being able to read all these critical scholars only when I left my own country, right? And this is such a massive contradiction for me, because when I went to university to do my bachelor's degree, university was for me my space of liberation. It was a space where I was going to get my freedom. I wasn't necessarily going to have to find a husband to support me. I was actually going to be able to support myself. So I have a huge respect for my university and for going to the university, but that's where I actually learned a lot of the things that I now have to unlearn and deconstruct. And I need to start with that first and foremost before I want to do anything else. And I'm not saying that I have now managed to do it completely, and I am not saying that I don't unconsciously make those mistakes. I very much feel like I am at some point in the research process of occupy the position of the colonizer and the colonized as well, and it's all very fluid and shifting. So I need to keep myself accountable, and that means for me self-reflection. It means for me engaging with a community of other people who I can share with and who will perhaps help me keep myself accountable. And that involves a huge emotional labor, but I don't think I could do it any other way.
Yeah. It feels like it's necessary work, and I completely agree with you. The need to reflect and raise your awareness, and when you're exposed to literature that finally names your experience, I get the sense where so for me it was Fanon. I wasn't introduced to Fanon until I started my PhD. And as soon as I read Black Skin, White Mask and Wretched of the Earth, I immediately felt empowered because I thought this is naming my experience. But then I felt angry, like you, in thinking it's taken me 26 years of my life to get to a point where that experience can actually be named now. So I completely agree with you. You go through a different set of emotions when you're exposed to knowledges that haven't been afforded to you before that point.
Yeah. And just to say, Linda Smith, they ask her a sort of a similar question. How do you sort of navigate this unlearning, and how do you navigate the feelings and emotions that you have? And she said, put it in your writing. You just channel that into your writing. And I think that is just a really interesting position. I think, especially from her perspective, right, the more Indigenous scholars work is acknowledged and published, I think it's going to be much more interesting to have that ecology of knowledges.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's what I think is important, right? Because it's also the way we're feeling. This is also new knowledge as well. It's important. I validate your feelings, validate your own feelings. They're very, very important. And also more important even is when we write them down and we express them and when we make them clear. This is what's happening from our own position. That's also very important because we are also creating, we are innovating. That's also very important. All what we're going through is essential as well to this process of innovation, decolonization, new narratives. That's part of it. So I think we should validate our feelings and our experience, write them down, being clear about it, and share them, because this is who we are. That's our experience. That's our life.
Yeah, absolutely. Ian, were you going to say something?
Oh, just about the question that you asked. I mean, you know, the research journey is a very much a personal journey. And I think that you need to be, like Andrea is saying, like constant reflection, and like that you had said about constant reflection is sort of essential part of it. I was thinking sort of later in my research about sort of, I was trying to come up with a way to sort of interpret my data, and I always found that whenever I came back to the data, I saw it differently. You know, and as we sort of decolonize ourselves, or as we sort of grow, we are always looking at the same thing from a different perspective. In the Iroquois Confederacy, they have the different peoples, the different tribes are all sort of have a sort of title to them, and they talk about the Iroquois Confederacy being the sort of longhouse. Longhouse is a sort of structure. It's essentially a longhouse where multiple family units would live in, and it has multiple doors and it has multiple entrances. And I always thought of the idea that that'd be quite interesting from a decolonizing perspective and from a research perspective, is like your context determines how you enter that house, and then how you enter that house determines how the house is viewed to you. And so like if you're entering from the eastern door, how the house looks is going to be quite different than when you enter from the western door, but you're always coming back to that same knowledge. And in Indigenous communities is obviously you're coming back to the same stories. And so one thing that was sort of the evolution in sort of my own research process and personal process was this idea that I was coming back to things I'd learned before from a different perspective and from a new perspective. And that in turn was part of the journey. That was an essential part of the journey. If you always entered from the same door because the same door was the door you always used, you never grew. You never viewed something from a different perspective. And I think that that's the one thing that's important as an Indigenous researcher, is constantly revisiting what you know, and that there is no one truth. There's multiple truths to any sort of circumstance, and all truths are subjective and based in quite a personal aspect. And that's sort of just my reflection on that.
Yeah, and that's a really powerful point, because a lot of the times when we're doing work with decoloniality, we assume that the knowledge that is, well, we know that the knowledge that that's been constructed around coloniality is taken for granted and assumed to be the norm, and it's the canon of knowledge that is expected within your work. And then as soon as we do decolonial work, there is again another assumption that we are striving to incorporate as much indigenous knowledge as possible, but we run the risk of creating new taken for granted. So I completely agree with you in the idea of constantly revisiting, doing that learning, doing that reflection, doing the unlearning necessary to be able to look at it from a different perspective is really important.
And I think challenging even the idea of what Indigenous research is, and I was thinking about a lot about Andrea's work coming into this, because I know quite a bit of her work, and one of the things that sort of stands is the idea of what Indigenous knowledge is needs to be challenged, and that idea that it's anti-scientific, but the reality is that it actually is quite scientific, and it's just embedded within a contextual structure. And the work that she does, with these communities that are trying to find novel ways to sort of deal with the ideas of development is really important, because they're essentially, if they were stuck in the idea of traditional, like quote unquote traditional knowledge from a rigorous definition, they wouldn't be able to use science as a means of challenging what they know in order to solve their own social science questions. But I think the real thing is that Indigenous knowledge is much more fluid in that. And I think that it is important to sort of not to rely on rigorous definitions and not get caught in the trap of, say, only Indigenous knowledge only looks like this, because Indigenous knowledge, it's science. It's the same science as anybody else, any other culture's science, and that's the really important aspect of it. Just because it's embedded in storytelling and been passed down in multiple generations doesn't mean that it doesn't have the same relevance as biology or chemistry, because those stories that you tell all have stories of biology and chemistry built right in them. We just haven't been able to listen to them long enough because we're sort of tone deaf by the cacophony of noise of Western academia. And I think that's what we need to do, is take that step away. And this is why I sort of advocate sort of the ignoring the academy and sort of building our own communities of knowledge and knowing, because once you sort of step away, we're looking at a society now that's by coronavirus, and we're seeing the benefits of that quiet. Like, look at animals in the zoo doing things that they never do that we hope they do, such as pandas, reproducing naturally. And this is the problem of the noise of, capitalism, progress, whatever you want to call it, and the constant need to isolate, put stuff into hierarchies, constantly to analyze rather than just stop, listen, let things happen, and I think that's sort of one thing that, sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent.
Yeah.
Can you just add, because I think with Ian, we've had conversations because around what is Indigenous, right? So what constitutes Indigenous, what is Indigenous knowledge, what's Indigenous ontologies and whatnot, right? Because a lot of the challenges I get within my group of peers is this sort of like a warning: don't romanticize the Indigenous people, right? Don't just assume that just because it's Indigenous is better than anything else and whatnot. So we've had conversations about that together. I think a big challenge is this idea of wanting to categorize things, wanting to measure things. I think that in itself is a very much Eurocentric Western way of trying to produce knowledge. And a lot of the Indigenous scholars I've been reading and I've been listening to, they don't even want to engage with that, because that's just not how they do research. That's not just how they think. And I think you mentioned it before, Moon, as well, right? You also ask yourself, I'm actually not quite sure what is Indigenous from this perspective. And I think there's this assumption that Indigenous knowledge and people have not been coexisting with other forms of knowledge throughout time. I think that is a false, that's not real. Like, there's always been a coexistence, and there's always been this idea of heterogeneous plural ways of thinking. It's just that what we have is a subordination of these forms of knowledge based on Quijano's idea of the systems of knowledge, you know, that the idea that gets translated, Eurocentric knowledge gets translated into universal knowledge.
Yeah.
And that is what we're challenging. And that's what a lot of the indigenous scholars are challenging, actually.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges of decoloniality is getting out of that mindset of everything needs to be defined using Eurocentric frameworks. The idea of needing to categorize, or that there has to be a binary. If colonialism is this, then decoloniality is that, and it's the opposite. And moving away from how we experience knowledge as opposed to how we define certain knowledges. So for a lot of the communities that I work with, and from my own community itself, there are so many knowledges that have influenced that community, that there isn't one single indigenous knowledge, but there is something that is experienced. So I think the idea of something being experienced and the idea of knowledge that can be held and named and labeled are sometimes convoluted, and it's confused. So I completely agree with you, Andrea. Not everything can be defined. Not everything can be fixed into like a dichotomous lens.
And it's a huge challenge. So in my case, for instance, I think a massive, I don't know if it's a cognitive dissonance, but there's definitely some form of dissonance in my head, is that even with this work that I'm doing and all the stuff I'm reading, I'm still operating within a very much Western-centric UK higher university, where I have to publish in top journals if I want to pass my probation, where, you know, if I want to be able to survive within academia, I still have to use their own frameworks, and I still have to exist in this world. And I know at some point I'm going to have to make a choice. I know at some point I'm going to have to decide, is this really what I want to do? You know, work within this system, which means that I actually have to continue, you know, trying to get published and trying to put my name out there, which is quite difficult for me to comprehend if I'm thinking actually the way in which I look at the world has changed because of this decolonial thinking. I think that is a massive contradiction that I need to come to terms with, and at some point make a choice.
Yeah, and that brings us back to the idea of in-betweenness, and not just in terms of how we view ourselves as researchers, but how we're constantly navigating that space, and that space of conflict and mess. So Linda Tuerces talks about the fact that research is messy, and being in that space of just being constantly in conflict is part of our existence as researchers doing this work. And it is really difficult that I don't have an answer to that. And I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of the work that is around decoloniality, particularly around research, places a huge amount of emphasis on self-care, because this is work that is emotional labor as much as it is intellectual labor.
Yeah.
So what do you do as part of your self-care? So this will be a really good way for us to just close off the conversation, because we could go a lot deeper into a lot of the different topics, but I am conscious of the fact that we've been speaking for about an hour. So just to finish it off, what do you do as part of your self-care when you're doing this work? Because again, it is intellectual, but it is also emotional labor.
For me, it's very important. It actually, I think what you're commenting about betweenness and finding ourselves in conflict.
Carolina, sorry, the connection isn't great.
That is a good thing. Critique, disruption. I think it's needed. And I
Carolina?
continue. I know it's hard, but I think we are. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. Sorry, the connection was going bad. I can hear you now. Do you want to say that again? I didn't hear your response.
Sorry. I don't know what else can I do.
Do you want to just check your connection, and then we will check with Andrea and Ian and then come back to you? Okay, Andrea?
Sure. I think she's still talking.
Yeah, so even if we're in places of conflict, even if we are in places in conflict, critique disruption, I think is
Do you want me to try to give it a go?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so your question was, what do we do for self-care?
Yeah.
I think it's a good question. I definitely think this experience with COVID has made me stop, and there's been a bit of a shock within my own system. I think I don't do enough self-care. I think I try to have conversations with other people that think like me, that share similar views, and try to just, find in those communities, find some support. I think that is what I try. That's the thing I do that's the most closely to self-care. Yeah, I mean, if you have any suggestions, I'll be happy to hear you, because you talk a lot about that, and I think that you're absolutely right. It's just that I feel like I've been in automatic for so long that I haven't really actually thought about it for myself.
Yeah, I wish I could give you some suggestions, but I think for me, I've really been reflecting a lot, and the idea of community and allyship is so important because it's about creating those networks and people to, a lot of them, particularly during the PhD process, it was finding people that validated my experiences of the process was really helpful, so that I wasn't gaslighting myself and thinking, am I going crazy in thinking these things, or these feelings of anger or frustration or guilt, are they reasonable? So having people to talk through to really helped. And then, as Ian said, getting to a point where you almost have to ignore that the structures are there and get on with it, which is easier said than done, but it's almost getting yourself into that mind space where you put it as a distraction, and you think this is still going to be there later on, and I need to go and do the work that is meaningful, rather than taking on a battle that is beyond me. So I think for me, it's just been about trying to create a sense of what this space actually is, and then see it for what it is and work within it the best that I could, but acknowledging the fact that I'm always going to be in a space of conflict, and any research that I do will always undoubtedly be messy. I think once you come to that place of acceptance, then it gets easier. Well, I found it has gotten easier for me. What about you, Ian? What do you do as part of your self-care?
The odd cry, I think. I have the odd cry. I was actually really, so that you posted something on Twitter today actually, about decisions you make are based on other people's expectations. You will always feel the weight of their criticism and hold out for their praise. And I was lucky enough to have criticism right off the get-go, so I didn't have to worry about having praise. And I think that sort of helped me, is that I haven't had the expectation that criticism is going to come. But that being said, validation is hugely important, and I think that community we talked about is incredibly important. Having people who believe in you, having examples of work, which is why it's important for us to do the work that we're doing and the tough steps of the journey that we have to take, because what was the quote, I looked up the road and looked back down the road, and I found neither option was essentially good, so I cut my own path. And that's essentially what you have to do. And I guess you do have to sort of come to the realization that it's going to be tough work, because you're going against the current, And you know, having people who can along the way say, I really find this work important, or thanks for doing this. And I think that they aren't that hard to find, because we're embedded in these communities that are part of a colonial structure that are dealing with decolonization. And so when you say something, they're thinking like, man, I've been waiting for someone to say something exactly like this. I think that's worthwhile. Or when you read something that you think, yeah, why didn't I read this before when I was embedded in my own context? That's worthwhile. You almost are validated when you come across an article or something like that. And recognize that it's just difficult, and there, you know, you are going to have moments where you feel like you made the wrong. Why couldn't I just make it easier on myself? You know, but
I think we've all had those moments in research where we think, I should have just chosen an easier research topic. It shouldn't have been this.
The blue pill. I should have taken the blue pill.
Carolina, is your connection working?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
So very briefly, I want to say, yes, looking after ourselves and also accept who we are. Validation is very important, and also for me, it's very important to have this role, accept this role of distraction, critique. I think it's very important. We need it, and especially I'm doing this for the young ones, for the coming up generations, because we are also teachers, right? So we are transmitters, and we are transmitting new knowledge and new ways. So I think this is very important. That's what makes me feel happy, and also a sort of self-care, accepting who I am, accepting my role, and that's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
And I often say to people when they ask why I do decolonial work, a part of me is about honoring the work that people have already done before us, and keeping it almost like an internal promise to carry on that journey and carry on that process of resistance in doing that work. But it's also legacy work, because we may not see the impact or the effects of what we're doing in our generation, but having that hopefulness that it will stay, and that knowledge will still continue to exist, and that it will hopefully inform change for those that come after us, just as we are working and building on the bricks that have already been laid for us. So just being a part of the process is just something that's really important. Thank you guys so much. Andrea, sorry, did you want to say something before we finish off?
I was just because of what you're saying, there's this poem by Alice Tepunga Somerville, who's from the University of Waikato, and she has, it's very quick. She says, may I grow old enough to be forgotten, may my questions become passé, may my bibliographies become outdated, may my theories be superseded, may I be obsolete. May I teach students who teach students who teach students. May I meet these younger thinkers at conferences. May I read and cite their work. May I watch them stand more stably than I could have ever dreamed. May I sit in committee meetings where young colleagues raise new challenges because the old ones have finally been put to rest. May I watch the old guard quietly move on, but more than this, may I live long enough to be part of an old guard who young scholars wish would retire. May I see scores of Indigenous scholars write hundreds of Indigenous books to ask thousands of Indigenous questions. May I lie on a future deathbed and look back with regrets related to work rather than regrets related to family. May my passing be unshocking, not early, not expecting. May I run out of ideas before I run out of time.
Great quote.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
And that's the perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you guys so much for sparing the time to speak with me, and I look forward to hearing more about your journeys moving forward. And if you do want to come on for another episode, then just simply give me a message, because again, there are so many things that we've touched upon that we can delve deeper into. But thank you once again.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.